Welcome back to the I and Thou video series. I was just explaining to my guest. It's from Martin Buber. Martin Buber was a theologian, and he said a lot of people relate to God as an it, namely, what can you do for me? The way some people relate to other people in Los Angeles. When you move to Los Angeles, it seems like everybody you meet is your friend if you can help their career. So you meet them and they start asking you who you know and who you're connected to, and suddenly, this person, but if you can help them, they move on pretty quick. So you're an it. But you're a thou when somebody likes you and is interested in you just for who you are. So Martin Buber said, imagine having a relationship with God where God wasn't an it, you see. So I present to you today's guest, Olga Mazurkiewicz.
So you had mentioned Los Angeles. Have you lived in Los Angeles, Richard?
I had a friend who moved back there, back to Buffalo.
Uh-huh.
I said, wow, you went there for your comedy career. What's going on? And he said, well, I couldn't stand the way people acted. He said, it really got to me after a while that nobody was really your friend. Everybody was your career opportunity. Why, have you ever experienced that in your travels?
I've been there. So I've been there twice. I've been there once to visit with an ex-boyfriend who was a boyfriend at the time, to visit some friends of his who lived in the Hollywood Hills. And that was a very funny experience because we were there without a car. And of course, being a Brooklynite, nobody knows how to drive. So being in Los Angeles without a car is a pretty interesting experience because you tend to share the road with other people who are not driving, which tends to be people who are either addicted to drugs or out of the mental institution. I mean, unfortunately, at the time that we went, it was pretty wild. I was like, oh my God, this is nuts. I never...
So you were associating with people who had mental illness?
Well, you walk around on the street and you kind of see people talking to the other people that are walking, or people either who are talking to themselves, or I think we also, I guess we passed by Skid Row, and Skid Row is pretty rough still to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And
was there a sense of danger in the air?
Somewhat. I just felt that it was really interesting. It was one of the, at that time I hadn't left New York City or Brooklyn for extended periods of time. I grew up there in Brooklyn. So it was completely different than what I experienced in Brooklyn. So in Brooklyn there was a lot of danger, but in Los Angeles the problem was that people tried to entice you into the danger without really being open about what it was. Whereas New York, when there was danger, it was very open. So that if there was a drug deal, you knew that there was a drug deal, and the drug dealers knew that you knew, and it wasn't an issue. But I felt like in LA, what I didn't really like, and I found it utterly disturbing, was that people tried to entice you into something that's not what it seems by deceiving you, which I really did not like. So that part, the streets part, the walking part, the getting around part was really strange and unusual, weird, I would say. I would call it weird. And then being with his friends in the Hollywood Hills was amazing. They had a beautiful house, but it was also really surreal because we went over. So first we went over to like one of their friends' houses, right? Because they're all in the hills. So one of the first things she does is she took me on a walking tour of the houses in this area, right? And that was really surreal because we're just walking around. It's very beautiful, right? You're like up on the hill. You kind of like see the rest of the city. And there was one set of neighbors who had monkeys in their front yard, and I thought, oh, this is like really absurd. Like why, as pets, they had them as pets.
I see. These are not statues.
No, they were like real monkeys, right? And she's like, oh, those neighbors, they have monkeys. We were kind of laughing about it, like, and I was like, oh, that's really bizarre. Like, why would they do that? You know what I mean? Like, this is so bizarre. And then that same day we went to, she's like, oh yeah, someone invited us for a dinner party. Why don't you guys come along? They had a daughter. So I was hanging out with the daughter. I think I was like in my early 20s and their daughter was like maybe 11 or 12. So it was nice, I think, for her to kind of hang out with somebody who was not an adult, right? And so we went to this dinner party and it was completely absurd because the guy was standing, he's standing, it's beautiful. you see the city, and then in the back you see the neighbors' houses, and we walk into his house and he's standing at the window looking at the neighbors, looking at his pool and looking at the neighbor's pool, right? And he's really depressed because his pool is not as good as the neighbor's pool, right? And for me, I was like, to me it was very mind-blowing to be in a situation where, okay, you have this house in the Hollywood Hills and you have a pool. You know what I mean? This is like so amazing, and you're complaining because your pool is not as nice as the neighbor's pool. And that's I just found it like really bizarre, you know, from my perspective. It's like, wow, look at all the things that you do have, you know, but you're focusing on the thing that, you know, so it strikes me as I don't know, people are very dissatisfied from what I experienced there. His friends were actually not, because they weren't really in the entertainment business, and for some reason they weren't really like that. They weren't focusing on, oh, we don't have this, we don't have that. You know, they were just kind of living their lives. They were a family, they had the daughter, and they were super happy. So, you know, I don't know. Now that I have a kid, I would venture to say it's maybe because they had the kid too, because that brings you another level of appreciating the world in ways that are not just about material objects, I think. But what do I know? You know?
Well, you can speak from your life experiences.
Right. I mean, my observations, you know?
Yeah. Well, your life experience is more than your observation.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, yes, in comparison to this guy, I mean, I just thought it was so absurd. I was I wasn't going to admonish him. I almost like burst out laughing, you know what I mean? Because I'm like, oh my God, this is like some weird like sitcom or something. Like, what is going on here, you know?
Yeah.
This can't possibly be real life. Like, his house was so beautiful with like all this glass everywhere. You know, I had never seen a house like that before in my life. And I was like, okay, you know?
And he was unsatisfied.
He was completely unsatisfied, you
Yeah.
know? But I think he was also alone. He lived alone, you know?
Yeah.
And now thinking back on it, I would venture to say that that's, you know, my hypothesis would be that, because it sucks as you get older to be alone and not really to have somebody to share your life with and your experiences. Maybe that's why it would be good to have that relationship with God, because you can, you know, have a back and forth.
Back and forth?
Who knows? Who knows?
I've been reading this book about jokes that are thought-provoking but not funny.
Oh, that's awesome.
Can I tell you one of the jokes?
I would love to hear one.
Do you know who Yuri Gagarin was?
Is he a Russian astronaut, perhaps?
First one. First person in space.
Okay.
All right, so he's gigantic hero, you know, he comes back and parades and everything, and he gets to meet Khrushchev. And Khrushchev and him are just sitting down one-on-one, and Khrushchev says, what did you feel being the first person in space, and you looked out that window and you saw everything? And he said, I got this feeling that I can totally understand why people think that there is a God, because the beauty and the wonder of all of creation just overwhelmed me. And Khrushchev said, I know what you mean, but don't talk about that. He said, just keep that between you and me. He said, okay. So other countries want to meet Yuri Gagarin, and he goes on his public relations tour, and he winds up at the Vatican. And he's sitting one-on-one with the Pope. And the Pope says, wow, what did you think when you looked out and you saw the earth down below? And Yuri Gagarin remembered his talk with Khrushchev, and he said, I thought about how amazing human beings are, that we have developed the technology, that we can go into space and we can observe the world and all that we have done to use our minds. And I reflected on how foolish it is to think that there is a God when humans have so much potential. You know what the Pope said? He said, I agree with you. I totally understand your point of view, but let's not talk about that because there's people that would be upset if you said that.
Let's keep that between us.
Right. So what is the moral of that joke?
I don't know. The moral of the joke is that it's funny. I think I think that's the moral of the joke. I also think that it's really funny depending on your perspective, right? How you perceive something. So, and very much it's a political joke, I think, right?
Here's my interpretation of that joke. The suppression of speech.
Mm-hmm.
Khrushchev said, you have to suppress your thoughts on that and not talk about it for this higher good,
Mm-hmm.
namely the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
Don't upset it. And you won't upset it if you don't talk about that. And the Pope said the exact same thing.
Mm-hmm.
There is a status quo. Don't talk about it, and you won't upset the status quo. And I'm wondering, I thought about that, and I said, are there people I know who suppress my thoughts
Mm-hmm.
because they will upset the status quo?
Mm-hmm. I'm sure there are.
And I'm wondering if you have come across people who have asked you to suppress your thinking because it will upset the status quo.
Well, I think it happens every day. I mean, from very little things. You know, I think you can see it in bigger things like the joke with Khrushchev and the Pope, but also just in little things at work, you know. Don't ask so many questions. Don't, you know, this is your role. Your role is you're the one who works. You're not the one who makes the decision, whatever, right? So there's that. But also I think in relations with other people, right? Even with friends, when you start to talk about things that people find disturbing to their own sense of themselves,
Mm-hmm.
even if they're really good friends with you, they'll actually push you away.
Yeah,
Right.
and I'm undergoing that right now myself. With my friend with the broken heart.
Right, but he was doing better, no? I saw on Facebook
Yeah, he performed.
yeah, I saw that. That was amazing.
Well, the woman who broke his heart was in the audience,
Oh.
and she acted like he did not exist.
That's awful.
And I went up to her and I said, how are you handling this situation of you and him being in the same room? And he said, well, no, she said, I'm sorry, he isn't even there. You know, I mean, he's he's somewhere else in the building. And she said, well, you know, he called me and said he wanted to have a sit down. So we got together. And it went very well. And he was his recovered self, all right? And that was that. But then the next day, I started getting texts, and then I started getting emails, which had the underlying message of "we are meant to be together" type of thing. And she said, I realized that I'm in a situation now where if I'm the slightest bit warm, he's going to interpret that in the wrong way. So I have to be distant and cold. Well, that did a number on his mind, all right? Because technically now he's splitting into two people. The person who's moving on, she's got her life, I got my life. And the person of, we are always meant to be together, and you are the perfect person for me, you know? And you can see this when you talk to him, that sometimes he's the one person and sometimes he's the other. And I pointed this out to him, and then he will recoil because I'm telling him things he doesn't want to hear.
He's not ready, I think. I mean, I think that's part of it too, but that's my own interpretation of it, having grown up with a mom who's mentally ill. So I think that, you know, it's very delicate, right? So it's like our sense of ourselves, our egos, what makes us function as human beings within this society that we live in is also sometimes separate from how we perceive ourselves, what we want to be, right? What we can be. And And I think that it's a very fine dance that you have to do, right? Because sometimes so for instance, if you push someone too much, it actually has the opposite effect of what you want, right? Because you want to kind of open them up and get them to deal with things, for instance, right? But sometimes if you do it too much or in the wrong way, it actually makes them regress more.
Yeah.
So, it's funny because we found Fight Club in the secondhand store, like a Blu-ray of it, and we were just watching it, and it makes me think of that with like Ed Norton and Brad Pitt and the two sides of his personality, right?
Yeah.
At the end, he realizes,
He does realize he's both people?
Well, he does. He's not supposed to, but then he talks to Brad Pitt, and Brad Pitt says, I'm the person that you wish you were, I'm like super buff, I'm super attractive, I fuck better than you, or like you want. You know what I mean?
I'm
So-
your ideal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's how you perceive yourself in your own mind. And really, the story itself is just kind of like him getting to the point where he can get closer to that, but even in a very destructive way, which I thought was really interesting. I think the movie's great. I think it's an amazing movie. I think it has really amazing scenes. But I think that's very much sometimes I think it's brutal and violent to break out of your mold. You know what I mean? And I think even your parents try to put you in a mold because they think that your life will be easier that way, right? Because that's how they're taught. And depending on who they were and how much they adhered to the mold or not, they pass some of that on to you, right? So, and in order to really become a person, you have to violently extract yourself from that. Do you know what I mean? So like, for instance, teenagers, they rebel, right? It's not like a nice thing. They're not like, oh, mom, can I go and do this? Can I do that? It's like a violent, no, this is who I am. This is what it is, right? And I think that's really necessary for the development of an individual person, right? And even if you look at it in terms of theology, I think that humans have to push away from God, from the one, in order to become individuals, right? Because if you were always just part of the one, there would be no individuality of who you are.
Now, boy, you said a lot of things there, and I couldn't really take them all in. You were saying them so fast. So did you say that your mother tried to put you into a mold?
No.
Then you rejected it?
So in my case, it wasn't my mother, it was my grandmother.
Your grandmother. So your grandmother, this is cool. This is very interesting.
She raised me.
So you got to see your mother's development because your mother was raised by your grandmother firsthand, because your grandmother raised you.
Exactly, right? And so my mother is not, I have a very strange relationship with my mother because it's not like she's my mother.
In
It's
some
like
regards, she's your sister, right?
Yes, and I'm the older sister, or I'm her mom too, because I always try to help her, So it's complicated, right? So you can see why we butt heads.
Now, did your grandmother try to put you in a mold?
Of course.
Did you resist?
Of course. Look at me. My grandmother was born, my grandmother is also an incredible story. She was born in 1918. She lost her parents to cancer when she was, I think, a teenager, right? And then her first marriage was a total madness. So she married some guy who locked her in the house and wouldn't let her out of the house. Granted, she was a bit of a flirt from the pictures that I saw of her. So I could see why the guy would be a little bit freaked out. So she actually got the marriage annulled because he literally locked her in the house. Like, she couldn't leave the house, and she escaped and got the marriage annulled.
What country was this?
In Poland.
Okay.
And so then she married my grandfather, who had had a family prior to her. He had a wife and 2 daughters.
You mean at the same time?
They got captured by the Nazis.
Oh.
And the Nazis killed his family in front of him and let him go.
So he had that scar, that burden to carry.
He was insanely violent.
He became violent because of the violence he witnessed.
He was, yes.
You ever meet him?
No.
Oh.
I mean, he died a little after I was born, but I was really just
Yeah.
a couple months old.
Yeah.
So, but he also had scars on his back because they beat him. They cut his finger off. So, and he had a temper. He had like, what they called back then nerves, right? He had like a,
That was the euphemism.
yeah. So he couldn't really take very much, right? You couldn't really talk to him
you could
too
only
much.
disagree with him up to a point, and then he might get...
Right, and he was very strict. He was super strict. So he then had 2 daughters with my grandmother
yeah.
and a son that died during the war because they actually had a baby during the war. Their house got bombed
Yeah.
and leveled. And the son got pneumonia and died, and they
Yeah.
buried him. They don't remember where because they were somewhere else.
Yeah.
And he was super strict with the daughters. My mom told me a story that she went out with some male friend of hers at the time, and the guy tried to grope her, and she resisted, and she got into a fight with the guy because then he kind of got very physical with her, and she came home, I think, with like a bruise or something like that, and my grandmother had to hide her in the attic because if my grandfather saw that, he would hit her.
He would hit her.
For going to the house. It's like, no, it's your fault. You went to the guy's house. Why did you go to the guy's house by
So
yourself?
there was misogyny in underneath this whole
Well,
thing.
it was, I mean, at that time, that's how people thought, right? So
And he bought into that.
right, but if it's the whole culture and society, how can you not? I think it's
Well-
very difficult. You know what I mean? I think it's an exceptional person, and they're not.
Well,
that many.
I used to think the same way. Like, you have to give someone a pass if they're living during a time when everybody thinks a certain way. Until somebody pointed out to me, they said, well, people say that, Thomas Jefferson, he had slaves. I mean, but everybody had slaves, and it was the way things were done at that time. And they said, but it's funny that Hamilton somehow resisted all that.
And how did he do that, though? I'm curious about
Because
how.
there are people in every era of integrity who say that this is wrong, I'm not going to do it. And that made a lot of sense to me.
Right, but those people are very few and far between, right? So can you then blame the entire? I don't know if it makes sense to be very. I understand what you're saying, and I agree with you. I think that those people should be a model.
Yeah.
I just don't think the majority of people will be that, even if you make those people the model. Because people have a tendency to, when they're in groups, to kind of groupthink.
Yeah.
It's just kind of a part of human nature.
Right. I have a slightly different way of expressing it. I say that all of our lives are governed by ideas, and we get those ideas from the society. All right? And we don't even realize it, that the ideas that are running our lives we got from somewhere else. But some of us, we start exploring and we try to see what ideas are running my life. And once you discover what those ideas are, then you have the power to change them.
I agree. I also think there's an element to, there's a speech that a friend of mine used in a song by Martin Luther King about the drum major instinct, right? About the desire to be first and to kind of bring all the other people along. And I feel like that drum major instinct, too, makes it so that people want to bring other people into their ideas and kind of activate this situation where they accept their ideas as is without the thinking, right? And that there's a kind of tension in people themselves, right? In the society, but in people themselves between, for instance, being an independent and being very much a part of the society, right? Between freedom, like the ultimate freedom, right? Which is you do whatever you want, no matter the cost, or being a more social being and kind of accepting certain limitations and compromises based on other people around you, right? And I think that those are just constants of being a human being, those tensions between these different things. So hence the angel and the devil thing, that's part of that as well. It's just in a different form. It's kind of expressed in the form of the ideas of the time. So that one side is, no, do the right thing, be a good person. No, be selfish. I mean, what's his name? Anton LaVey, right? The Satanic Bible is all about, no, you do everything for yourself. Forget about everybody else.
Right. It's very Nietzschean. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
In a certain way. I mean, I think Nietzsche's really misinterpreted. I actually tend to like him, but
Who, Nietzsche or
Nietzsche.
LaVey? Oh.
And I think LaVey is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if growing up in Poland during communism, I don't know if I'd agree with everything that he said,
Mm-hmm.
because I do think that community is really important.
Yeah.
For the
What, you mean he grew up in Poland?
No, I did.
You did.
So I wouldn't say
You grew up in a European country?
Until 6.
Until 6. Okay. All right. And you're saying that you saw things that would contradict doing everything for yourself.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes, and I think that's part of because I think your experience as much shapes you. Also, for instance, if you're a person who explores things,
Yeah.
right? Your experience of the world does shape what you think and what you believe, right?
Yeah.
And especially, I think it happens. I didn't really perceive it until it started happening to me. But I think as you get older, you have a phase in your life where you're exploring, where you're checking things out, you want to know everything, see everything, and then you realize the amount of things that there are to know and see is so infinite
Yeah.
that you cannot possibly do that.
Yeah.
So then you choose some things that are interesting to you, right? And you go down certain paths, and as you go down those paths, those doors of possibility close more and more and more and more, right, on you until you come to your own death, and that's when it's like the final closing of the door. So, it's really interesting because your decisions shape who you are, and you can have a very conscious choice in that. But you can also, there's things that shape you that are unconscious, right? I mean, it's very Freudian, but it's true, right?
Uh-huh.
So my upbringing in this communist country, and I don't know if so Poland wasn't completely communist. It was forced on them.
Uh-huh.
But what I do think is really amazing about Polish culture
Mm-hmm.
is their sense of community. And I actually think that in Polish culture, that's driven a lot by the religion and a shared history,
Mm-hmm.
which is kind of antithetical to other places, right? Because religion in a lot of places tends to be something that suppresses
Mm-hmm.
people's culture and their intellectual ideas. Whereas in Poland, I think that for a good amount of time, at least like 70s and 80s, it was much more this liberation theology that actually brought people together to fight against the common enemy, who was Russia, who was trying to basically take over.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think Poland has a long history of fighting for their liberation, since they've always wanted to have a country of their own.
Mm-hmm.
Because of their geographical location in Europe. Because I had a friend who studied military history, and I didn't realize it, but he told me, if you can get across Poland, you get to the Ukraine, and there you have resources in terms of war,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can actually then go on to fight into Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, everybody of any note who wants to conquer the world, who wants to conquer Russia, and that's when they fall. But so I think that there's something in Polish history and culture that's so much part of who they are.
Mm.
And I would say who I am, right? It's like somehow a part of me. I was born there, and I can't even explain. It's not, some people didn't tell me that,
Mm-hmm.
but just learning like the history of the country and having my parents tell me their stories, I feel like that's very much a part of who I am.
Mm.
I really identify with it.
So do you follow contemporary politics in Poland, for example?
Somewhat. It's very corrupt, so I try to stay away from politics because I just get annoyed. That's the problem. Because there's very little to be done.
You mean that you can do to help the situation? Yeah, I was talking to somebody about that recently, who said, I don't watch the news because I see injustice in the world and I can't do a thing about it. And I said, well, you have to look at it in terms of history. Now, suppose we're living during the time of the Vietnam War. A person could say, I'm not going to watch the news because there's injustices on TV and I can't do anything about them. So they wouldn't watch it. They wouldn't talk about it with their friends. And as a result, nothing would change. Luckily, there were people who did watch it, who did talk about it with their friends, and it brought the war to an end.
No, I agree. I think time has changed.